The scream tore through the great hall before anyone understood what was happening. King Draven Ashbourne dropped his goblet, and it shattered against the stone floor, the sound sharp and final. His hand clutched his chest, as his knees buckled beneath him. Guards rushed forward, but no one knew what to do. The most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories was falling, and nothing could stop it. Moments earlier, the hall had been filled with quiet murmurs. Delegates from a neighboring pack had arrived under the banner of peace, offering wine as a gesture of goodwill. Draven had accepted the cup without suspicion. He had ruled for 12 years without a single attempt on his life. He trusted too easily, and that trust had just become his downfall. By the time his personal guard, a broad-shouldered man named Garrick, reached his side, the king's lips had turned pale, and his breathing had grown shallow and uneven. The delegates who brought the wine were nowhere to be found. They had vanished through the side corridors the moment the king collapsed, leaving behind only empty cups and a silence that pressed down on the hall like a physical weight. Word spread through the castle faster than fire through dry grass. The king had been poisoned. Servants whispered it in the kitchens. Soldiers repeated it on the walls. By nightfall, every soul in Veyrath knew that their king lay dying in his chambers, and no one could say if he would see the sunrise. The royal physicians were summoned at once. 3 of them arrived within the hour, each one trained since childhood in the healing arts, each one carrying instruments and herbs passed down through generations of court service. The eldest among them, a stern man named Bastian, examined the king first. His hands moved with practiced precision over Draven's chest and throat, checking his pulse, his breath, the color beneath his eyes. "It is wolfsbane," Bastian said finally, straightening up, "mixed with something else, something I do not recognize." The second healer, a woman named Ophelia who had studied under 3 different masters before earning her place in the royal court, leaned in closer. She smelled the king's breath and frowned deeply. "There is a second poison layered beneath it," she said. "I have seen wolfsbane before. I have treated it a dozen times. But this is different. It clings to the blood in a way I have never encountered." The third healer, a younger man named Godfrey, who had been trained specifically in rare toxins, tried 3 different remedies over the following hours. Each one failed. The king's condition did not improve. If anything, his breathing grew more labored with each passing hour, and a cold sweat had begun to soak through his sheets. By the second day, panic had settled over the castle like a fog that refused to lift. The king had no named heir. His closest advisor, a fierce and loyal beta named Kale, had taken command of the daily affairs of the kingdom. But even he understood that a kingdom without a king for long was a kingdom inviting war. Enemy packs beyond the borders would smell weakness the moment word escaped these walls, and word always escaped eventually. Kale stood at the foot of the king's bed on the evening of the second day, watching the healers argue among themselves. Bastian insisted on bleeding the poison out through the traditional method. Ophelia argued that bleeding would only weaken the king further. Godfrey suggested a rare root that grew only in the eastern mountains, but by the time anyone could retrieve it and return, the king might already be gone. "There must be something else," Kale said, cutting through their argument. His voice carried the weight of a man who had spent years commanding soldiers into difficult decisions. "Some healer, somewhere, who knows this poison." Bastian scoffed. "We are the finest healers in the kingdom. If we do not know it, no one does." "And yet the king still lies dying," Kale replied coldly. "Your title does not seem to matter much right now." The room fell silent. Ophelia, to her credit, did not argue the point. She simply lowered her eyes and returned to studying the vials before her, searching for something, anything, that might explain what she was seeing in the king's blood. It was a young servant girl, barely 16 years old, who offered the first real thread of hope. She had grown up in a village near the edge of the Whisperwood, a dense and ancient forest that bordered the kingdom's western lands. The Whisperwood was a place most people avoided. Old stories claimed the forest held creatures that did not answer to any pack, plants that could kill with a single touch, and paths that shifted depending on the traveler's intentions. But the girl remembered something from her childhood, something whispered among the villagers who lived closest to those dark trees. "There is a woman," she said quietly, when Kale finally noticed her hovering near the doorway, "in Hollow Creek. Her name is Alara. Her grandmother used to treat sicknesses that no city healer could touch. People said she walked the Whisperwood like it was her own garden." Kale studied the girl carefully. "And this Alara, does she still practice?" She runs the old shop now, the girl said. Since her grandmother passed, people still come from far away when the city healers fail them. It was a thin thread to hang a kingdom's future on, but with the king fading and the royal healers exhausted of ideas, Cale saw no better option. He mounted his horse before dawn the next morning and rode for Hollow Creek himself, unwilling to trust this errand to anyone else. The village was smaller than he expected, tucked into a valley where the forest cast long shadows even at midday. He found the herb shop easily enough, its wooden sign weathered by years of rain and sun, hanging slightly crooked above the door. Dried herbs hung in bundles from the ceiling inside, filling the air with a mixture of scents that Cale could not quite name. Mint and something sharper, something like burnt sugar and old rain. A young woman stood behind the counter, sorting through a basket of roots with quick, careful hands. She looked up when the bell above the door rang, and Cale saw something in her eyes that surprised him. She did not look startled by his presence, nor impressed by the fine cloak that marked him as a man of the court. She simply looked at him, the way a person looks at a problem they have not yet decided whether to solve. "You're a long way from the capital," she said. "You know who I am," Cale said. It was not quite a question. "I know what you are," she replied, setting down the roots. "A wolf, who has never had to ask for help before. It shows in how you stand." Cale did not have time for riddles, but something about her directness kept him from snapping at her. "The king is dying," he said instead. "Poisoned. 3 royal healers have failed to save him. I was told you might know something they do not." Alara's expression shifted, just slightly, the way a person's face changes when a memory surfaces unexpectedly. She set the basket aside entirely now, giving him her full attention. "What are the symptoms?" she asked. Cale described everything he had witnessed. The pale lips, the shallow breathing, the strange resistance the poison showed to every remedy the healers attempted. Alara listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing slightly as he spoke, as though she were assembling pieces of a puzzle in her mind. "Wolfsbane alone would not resist treatment this long," she said finally. "Not from healers as skilled as you describe. There is something else in that poison, something that grows only in the deep parts of the whisperwood. You know what it is?" "I know what it does," she said. "My grandmother wrote about a plant like this once. It hides its presence in the blood, waits, and multiplies its effect over time. Most healers never encounter it, because it only grows in places few people are foolish enough to walk." "But you have walked there." "Many times," Alara said simply. Cale studied her for a long moment. He had ridden through the night expecting to find an old woman with cryptic remedies, or perhaps a fraud looking to profit from the kingdom's desperation. Instead, he found a young woman who spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had faced real danger and returned from it unshaken. "Come with me," he said. "Save the king, and you will have whatever you ask for." Alara studied him back just as carefully. There was no eagerness in her expression, no hunger for reward or recognition. If anything, there was reluctance. "I do not do this for reward," she said, "and I do not know yet if I can save him. But I will not let a man die from a poison I might understand while pretending I do not." She began gathering supplies from the shelves around her without waiting for his response, moving with the efficient certainty of someone who had made difficult decisions many times before. Cale watched her, and for the first time since the king's collapse, he felt something close to hope settle in his chest. They rode for the capital before the sun had fully risen, Alara's satchel filled with jars and bundles that rattled softly against her horse's saddle. She did not speak much during the journey, her mind clearly working through possibilities, memories, half-remembered lessons from a grandmother who was no longer there to guide her directly. When they arrived at the castle gates, the guards eyed Alara with open suspicion. She wore simple traveling clothes, nothing like the fine robes the royal healers favored, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with soil and thorns rather than delicate instruments. Word had already spread that Cale had ridden out searching for a healer, and the court's whispered opinion had settled quickly into doubt. Bastian met them at the entrance to the king's chambers, his arms crossed, his expression already carrying judgment before Alara had said a single word. "This is your great hope?" he asked Cale, not bothering to lower his voice. "A village girl with a basket of weeds?" "She understands this poison," Cale said firmly, "which is more than I can say for the 3 of you at this point." Ophelia, standing near the king's bedside, studied Alara with slightly less hostility, though skepticism still colored her expression. If you know something we do not, girl, speak plainly. We have exhausted every remedy in our training. Alara did not flinch from their scrutiny. She walked past them toward the king's bed and knelt beside it, studying his face, his color, the faint tremor still visible in his hands, even in his weakened state. She lifted one of his eyelids gently, checking the color there, then pressed 2 fingers against his wrist to feel his pulse. You are treating this as a single poison, she said, without looking up. It is 2. Wolfsbane, as you already know, and beneath it, something that grows only within the Whisperwood's deepest paths. My grandmother called it shadow root. It does not respond to bleeding or to common antidotes because it does not act the same way in the blood. It waits, it builds, and if left untreated, it eventually stops the heart entirely. Godfrey, who had remained quiet until now, stepped closer with genuine interest rather than hostility. I have never heard of such a plant. Few have, Alara said. It does not grow anywhere near the villages or roads, only deep within the forest, in places most people are wise enough to avoid. And you know how to counter it? Kale asked. Alara straightened up, meeting his eyes directly. I know what ingredient is needed, but it must be gathered fresh, and it only reveals itself under moonlight, in a very specific part of the forest. If we wait until tonight, we may already be too late. The room fell into a heavy silence. Bastian's arrogance faltered slightly under the weight of what she was describing, though he clearly still resented the challenge to his authority. Ophelia's eyes had sharpened with something close to respect, even if she was not yet ready to admit it aloud. Godfrey simply nodded, already turning his attention to preparing whatever tools Alara might need. Then we do not have time to waste, Kale said. Tell me what you need, and I will see that you get it. Alara looked toward the window, where the afternoon light was already beginning its slow slide toward evening. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, the Whisperwood waited, ancient and unforgiving, holding the one thing that might save a dying king, and somewhere within its shadows, an enemy who had poisoned that king was likely still watching, waiting to see if their plan would succeed. She had no way of knowing yet just how much danger waited for her among those trees, or how much the course of the kingdom itself was about to change because of what she carried in her memory and her blood. All she knew was that a man was dying, and she was the only person who might stop it. I need until moonrise, she said, and I need to go alone. Kale's answer came without hesitation. No. Alara turned to face him fully, her patience thinning. You do not understand what that forest is. It does not forgive mistakes, and it certainly does not forgive strangers who bring soldiers stomping through its paths. Then I will not stomp, Kale said, but I will not let you walk into danger alone while I sit here waiting for news that may never come. If something happens to you, the king has no chance at all. I am coming, whether you welcome it or not. Bastian opened his mouth to object, likely more concerned with propriety than safety, but Kale silenced him with a single sharp glance. There was no more room for pride in this room, not with the king's breath growing shallower by the hour. Alara studied Kale for a long moment, weighing his stubbornness against the ticking clock she carried in her mind. Finally she exhaled and nodded once. Then you follow my lead. Every step. If I tell you to stop, you stop. If I tell you to stay silent, you stay silent. The Whisperwood punishes carelessness, and I will not carry your mistakes on top of my own. Agreed, Kale said. They left as the sun began its descent, riding west, until the road narrowed into little more than a deer path, and then abandoning the horses entirely at the forest's edge, where the trees grew so close together that no mounted rider could pass through without snapping a leg beneath a low branch. Alara moved with practiced ease across the uneven ground, stepping over roots that seemed to rise unnaturally from the earth, and Kale found himself struggling to match her pace despite his years of training as a soldier. The Whisperwood did not feel like an ordinary forest. The air grew heavier the deeper they walked, thick with a stillness that pressed against the ears. Sounds carried strangely here, distant and close at the same time, as though the trees themselves were listening to every footstep. Kale had walked through battlefields without flinching, had faced enemy packs twice his size without fear, but something about the silence of this place unsettled him in a way he could not explain. Stay close, Alara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The forest reacts to fear. It always has. My grandmother taught me that the moment you let panic take hold here, the paths begin to shift beneath your feet, leading you somewhere you did not intend to go. That sounds like superstition, Kale said, though he kept his voice equally low. Believe what you like, Elara replied. Just do not let your heartbeat give you away. They pressed deeper into the trees as the light faded, the canopy above growing so dense that stars became invisible, replaced instead by the faint silver glow of moonlight, filtering weakly through gaps in the leaves. Elara moved with quiet purpose, occasionally pausing to examine a cluster of roots or the bark of a tree, checking landmarks that Kale could not begin to recognize. It was nearly an hour into their walk when the first sign of danger appeared. A low growl echoed somewhere to their left, deep and guttural, unlike anything either of them had heard from ordinary wolves. Kale's hand moved instinctively to the blade at his side, but Elara caught his wrist before he could draw it. "Do not," she whispered urgently. "Drawing steel here provokes them further. They can smell metal being freed from its sheath before you even finish the motion. Then what do you suggest? We keep moving, steadily, show no fear, and do not run." Kale forced his hand to relax, though every instinct screamed against it. They continued forward, and the growling followed at a distance, circling somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of their eyes. Twice, Kale caught a glimpse of pale eyes reflecting faint light between the trees, watching them with patient interest. Elara never once broke her stride, though he noticed the slight tension in her shoulders that betrayed her own awareness of the danger surrounding them. "What are they?" he finally asked, unable to keep the question contained any longer. "Creatures that live only within the deepest parts of the wood," Elara answered. "They do not answer to any pack, and they do not fear alphas the way ordinary wolves do. My grandmother called them wardens. Whether that is truly what they are, I could not say. But they have never attacked me, not once in all my years walking these paths." "And if tonight is different?" Elara did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a certainty that Kale found strangely reassuring, despite the circumstances. "Then we will find out together." The growling eventually faded as they moved beyond whatever boundary the creatures seemed to guard, and the forest grew quiet once more, though the silence now felt different, watchful, in a way that made Kale grip his own resolve rather than his blade. He found himself studying Elara more closely as they walked, noting the calm confidence in every step she took, the way she seemed to read the forest like a language only she understood. "You said your grandmother taught you all of this," he said eventually, partly to fill the silence and partly out of genuine curiosity. "Where is she now?" "She passed 2 years ago," Elara said simply, no bitterness in her tone, only quiet acceptance. "She spent her whole life in these woods, learning what the city healers never bothered to learn. She always said that true medicine does not come from books alone. It comes from walking the same ground the sickness grows from." "And you continued her work." "Someone had to," Elara said. "The villages near here have no one else to turn to when the city healers turn them away for being too poor, or too far, or too strange in their symptoms. My grandmother never turned anyone away, no matter how little they could offer in return. I intend to carry that forward." Kale found himself struck by the simplicity of her answer, so different from the calculated ambitions he had grown used to hearing within the walls of the castle. There was no hunger for power in her voice, no desire for recognition. Only a quiet sense of duty that seemed to run as deep as the roots beneath their feet. They reached a small clearing, just as the moon climbed high enough to break fully through the canopy above, its light pooling silver across a patch of pale, delicate flowers growing along the base of an ancient, twisted tree. Elara knelt immediately, her fingers moving with careful precision as she began harvesting the blooms, taking only what she needed and no more, murmuring something under her breath that sounded almost like a quiet thanks, directed at the earth itself. "This is it?" Kale asked, crouching beside her. "This is it," she confirmed. "Moonbloom. It only opens fully under direct moonlight, and it wilts to nothing within hours of sunrise. If we had arrived even a day later, we might have missed this bloom entirely, and the next one may not surface for weeks." As she worked, a sudden snap of a branch echoed from the tree line behind them, sharp and deliberate, nothing like the natural sounds of the forest settling around them. Kale rose instantly, positioning himself between Elara and the sound, his senses sharpening as he scanned the shadows. 2 figures emerged from the darkness, moving with the calculated ease of trained hunters rather than lost travelers. Their scent carried something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to any of the packs sworn to Veyrath's territory. Kale recognized the markings on their cloaks a heartbeat later, the same symbol that had been stitched into the sleeves of the delegates who had poisoned the king. They followed us, Alara whispered, her hands still cradling the delicate blooms she had just gathered. They must have suspected we would seek a cure, Kale said grimly, and they cannot allow that cure to reach the king. The two intruders spread apart, clearly intending to flank them, their movements confident and practiced. Kale positioned himself to shield Alara, his years of training settling over him like a familiar cloak, though he understood the danger of fighting here, deep within a forest that answered to rules he barely understood. Get the bloom somewhere safe, he said quietly to Alara. Whatever happens, that plant must survive this night. I am not leaving you here alone, she replied firmly. This is not a discussion. No, she agreed. It is not, because I am not asking permission. Before Kale could argue further, one of the intruders lunged forward, and the clearing erupted into sudden motion. Kale met the attack directly, his blade finally drawn despite Alara's earlier warning, trusting that survival now outweighed whatever subtle balance the forest demanded. The second intruder circled toward Alara, clearly recognizing her as the true threat to their mission, now that the antidote's key ingredient rested in her hands. Alara moved faster than Kale expected, ducking beneath the intruder's reach and driving her elbow hard into his ribs, a technique that spoke of practice rather than luck. She was not trained for battle, but she was far from helpless, and the forest itself seemed to respond to the sudden disturbance within its borders. The low growling from earlier returned, closer now, and pale eyes began appearing at the edges of the clearing, watching the unfolding struggle with cold, patient interest. Kale forced his opponent back with a sharp twist of his blade, driving the man toward the tree line, where the growling grew louder still. The intruder's eyes widened with sudden fear as he realized what waited in the shadows behind him, and he turned to flee rather than continue his approach, disappearing into the darkness with his companion close behind, both of them clearly more afraid of the forest's hidden guardians than of Kale's blade. Silence returned to the clearing, broken only by their heavy breathing and the fading rustle of retreating footsteps. Alara straightened up, checking the pouch where she had carefully stored the moonbloom, relief washing over her features when she confirmed the blooms remained undamaged. "Are you hurt?" Kale asked, sheathing his blade and turning to face her fully. "No," she said. "You?" "Nothing serious." He studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, an acknowledgement that had not existed between them a few hours earlier. "You handle yourself well, for a healer. My grandmother believed a healer who cannot protect herself is a healer who will not live long enough to help anyone," Alara said, tucking the pouch securely against her side. "We should return before sunrise. The bloom will not last much longer once removed from the moonlight." They made their way back through the forest with renewed urgency, the earlier tension between them replaced by something closer to mutual respect. Kale found himself watching the trees around them differently now, no longer simply as an obstacle to endure, but as a place that had revealed something about the woman walking beside him, something that made him question the assumptions he had carried into these woods just hours before. By the time they emerged from the tree line and found their horses waiting exactly where they had left them, the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern sky. Alara moved quickly, checking the moonbloom once more, before securing it safely for the ride back to the castle. "We need to hurry," she said, mounting her horse. "This bloom will not hold its potency past midday, and the brew itself will take hours to prepare properly." Kale nodded, swinging onto his own horse. "Then let us not waste another moment." They rode hard toward the capital, the events of the night settling into memory even as new urgency took its place. Somewhere behind them, in the depths of the Whisperwood, the creatures that had watched their struggle returned to their silent vigil, indifferent now to the travelers who had passed briefly through their domain. And somewhere ahead, within the castle walls, a king lay waiting, his life balanced on the fragile petals of a flower that would not survive the coming afternoon. The castle gates opened the moment the guards recognized Kale's approach, and word of their return spread through the corridors, even faster than their horses could cross the courtyard. Servants pressed themselves against the walls to let them pass, whispering among themselves at the sight of the mud clinging to Alara's boots and the faint scratches along Kale's forearm from the earlier struggle. They found Bastian, Ophelia, and Godfrey, still gathered around the king's bedside, their faces drawn with exhaustion after another sleepless night spent monitoring his fading condition. Draven's skin had taken on a gray pallor that had not been there the day before, and his breathing had grown so faint that Ophelia had positioned a small feather beneath his nose, simply to confirm he was still alive. "You returned," Bastian said, though his tone carried more surprise than relief. "I did not expect you to survive that forest, let alone with anything useful." "We have what we need," Ilara said, already moving past him, toward the small table, where the healers kept their instruments. "But I need a private space to prepare the brew, away from distractions, and away from arguments." "The kitchens have been cleared for you," Kale said, gesturing toward the door. "I gave the order before we left." Ilara nodded her thanks, and moved quickly, carrying her satchel toward the castle kitchens, where the great stone hearth still glowed with the remnants of the previous night's fire. She set to work immediately, laying out the moon bloom, alongside the other ingredients she had gathered over the past 2 days, her movements precise, despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on her shoulders after a sleepless night in the forest. Bastian followed her, unable to resist observing the process even as skepticism colored every line of his expression. "This method you are using, it is not written in any text I have studied." "It would not be," Ilara replied, grinding a handful of dried root into a fine powder. "My grandmother never wrote her methods down. She believed some knowledge should only pass between hands, not through pages that anyone could misread or misuse." "That sounds like an excuse to avoid scrutiny," Bastian said. "Call it what you like," Ilara said, her tone even despite the insult buried within his words. "But this poison has already resisted 3 trained healers, and their careful study of every written text available to them. Perhaps it is time to consider that written knowledge alone is not always enough." Bastian fell silent at that, though his expression remained unconvinced. He watched as she combined the ground root with the moonbloom petals, adding them to a small pot of water that she had set to warm over the coals, the mixture releasing a faint, sweet aroma that seemed to fill the entire kitchen. Ophelia entered a short while later, drawn by curiosity despite her earlier doubts. "The king's breathing has grown weaker still," she said quietly. "Whatever you are preparing, I hope it works quickly." "It needs time," Ilara said, stirring the mixture with careful, measured movements. "If I rush this process, the brew will lose its effectiveness entirely, and we will have wasted the only moonbloom available to us. Patience now may cost us minutes, but carelessness would cost us everything." Ophelia studied the pot for a long moment, watching the steam rise in slow curls toward the ceiling. "My grandmother, too, was a healer," she said unexpectedly. "Though nothing like yours, I imagine. She served in a small village far from any city, treating farmers and their families with whatever grew nearby. I left that life behind to study here, believing city knowledge would always surpass village remedies." "And now?" Ilara asked, glancing up briefly. "Now I am no longer certain that belief was correct," Ophelia admitted. The kitchen fell quiet after that, filled only with the soft bubbling of the pot, and the distant sounds of the castle continuing its worried vigil beyond the walls. Ilara added a final ingredient, a small vial of dark liquid she had carried, carefully wrapped in cloth since leaving her shop days earlier, and the mixture shifted color slightly, deepening into a rich amber that caught the firelight. Bastian asked, his impatience finally breaking through his earlier hostility. "Not long now," Ilara said. "The final steeping is the most delicate part. If I remove it too early, the brew will lack strength. Too late, and the moonbloom's properties begin to fade entirely." She watched the pot with unwavering focus, occasionally adjusting the position of the coals beneath it to control the heat with precise care. Kale arrived partway through this final stage, having spent the intervening hours reassuring the anxious court that progress was indeed being made, though he offered no promises beyond that simple reassurance. "How is he?" Ilara asked without looking up from her work. "Fading," Kale admitted. "Godfrey believes we have perhaps a few hours left, if that." "Then we are exactly on time," Ilara said, though the tension in her voice betrayed how narrow that margin truly felt. Finally, after what felt like an agonizing eternity to everyone gathered in that kitchen, Ilara lifted the pot from the heat and strained the liquid through a fine cloth into a small cup, discarding the spent petals and roots that had given everything they could offer. The amber liquid steamed gently in the cup, its sweet scent now mixed with something sharper, almost medicinal. "This must be given while still warm," she said, lifting the cup carefully. "And it must be given slowly. Too much too quickly could shock a body already this weakened." They moved together toward the king's chambers, the weight of the moment settling over each of them differently. Bastian's skepticism had quieted into cautious hope. Ophelia walked with her hands clasped tightly before her, clearly praying beneath her breath. Godfrey simply watched Alara with open curiosity, already committing her methods to memory should he ever need them again. Draven lay motionless upon his bed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven movements that seemed to grow fainter with each passing minute. Alara knelt beside him, lifting his head gently with one hand, while bringing the cup to his lips with the other. "Your Grace," she said softly, though she doubted he could hear her in his current state. "This will help. I need you to swallow, even just a little." She tilted the cup carefully, letting only the smallest amount pass between his lips at first, watching closely for any reaction. When his throat moved in a weak swallow, she allowed a bit more, continuing this slow, deliberate process over several long minutes, until the cup had emptied entirely. Then, there was nothing to do but wait. The room settled into a tense silence that stretched on for what felt like hours, though the candle burning nearby had barely melted an inch during that time. Bastian checked the king's pulse every few minutes, his expression unreadable. Ophelia sat quietly near the window, her lips moving in silent prayer. Cale stood near the door, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Alara rather than the king, as though searching her face for any sign of doubt. Alara showed none. She sat beside the bed, watching Draven's chest rise and fall, her expression calm, despite the enormous weight resting on her judgment. She had done everything her grandmother had taught her, everything she understood about this rare and dangerous poison. Now, all that remained was patience, and hope that her knowledge had been enough. As the first hour passed without change, doubt began creeping into the room despite everyone's best efforts to remain composed. Bastian's expression grew tighter, his earlier skepticism threatening to resurface into something closer to accusation. "Perhaps this shadow root theory was mistaken," he said quietly, though not quietly enough to avoid Alara's notice. "It was not mistaken," Alara said firmly, though a flicker of doubt crossed her own features for the first time since they had returned from the forest. "The brew requires time to work through his blood. We must be patient. And if patience simply lets him slip away entirely," Bastian pressed. "Then we will have tried," Alara said, meeting his gaze directly. "Which is more than your 3 treatments accomplished over the past 2 days." The room fell silent again after that exchange, the tension thick enough to feel against the skin. Cale moved to stand beside Alara, his presence a quiet support though he said nothing aloud. She glanced at him briefly, grateful for the gesture even amid her mounting uncertainty. The second hour passed much like the first, the candle burning lower, the shadows in the room stretching longer as the afternoon light began its slow decline toward evening. Godfrey had begun pacing near the far wall, his earlier curiosity replaced now by genuine worry. Even Ophelia's prayers had grown quieter, as though she too feared that hope might not be enough this time. It was as the third hour began that something finally shifted. Draven's chest rose in a breath that was noticeably deeper than the shallow gasps of the previous days. His fingers, which had lain still and pale against the sheets for so long, twitched slightly, curling inward as though responding to some distant sensation returning to his body. "Did you see that?" Ophelia whispered, rising quickly from her seat by the window. Alara leaned closer, watching carefully as more color began returning to the king's lips, the gray pallor, slowly retreating, in favor of something closer to his natural warmth. His breathing steadied further, growing deeper and more even with each passing minute, the terrible rattling sound that had plagued his chest for 2 days, finally beginning to fade. "The shadow root is releasing its hold," Alara said, relief flooding through her voice, despite her attempt to remain composed. "The moon bloom is working." Bastian moved closer, checking the king's pulse once more, and this time, his expression shifted entirely, disbelief giving way to something he had not expected to feel toward this outsider from Hollow Creek. "His pulse has strengthened," he admitted quietly, significantly. The room seemed to release a held breath collectively, tension bleeding away into cautious hope. Alara remained beside the bed, watching Draven closely, as his body continued its slow return toward stability, though she knew from her grandmother's teachings that recovery from a poison this severe would not happen all at once. The worst of the danger had passed, but the king's body would need time to fully recover its strength. As evening settled fully over the castle, Draven's eyes finally opened, slow and unfocused at first, blinking against the candlelight as though waking from a very long and troubled sleep. Kale was at his side instantly, gripping his king's hand with a relief so profound it nearly broke through his usual composed demeanor. "Your Grace," Kale said, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "You are safe." Draven's gaze moved slowly across the room, taking in the exhausted faces of his 3 royal healers, the relief evident on Kale's face, and finally settling on Alara, who knelt quietly nearby, watching him with the careful attention of someone who had spent days fighting for this exact moment. "Who?" Draven managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you?" "Someone who owed you nothing," Alara said quietly, "and gave everything anyway." Draven's eyes remained on her for a long moment, confusion and gratitude mixing together across his weakened features, before exhaustion finally pulled him back into a deep, restful sleep, one that Alara assured them was entirely different from the dangerous unconsciousness that had gripped him for the past 2 days. Word of the king's recovery spread through the castle within minutes, and by nightfall, celebrations had already begun quietly among the staff and soldiers who had feared the worst for so long. But within the walls of the healers' quarters, a different mood had settled entirely. Bastian sat alone with his thoughts, his pride wounded by the reality that a village healer had succeeded where he and his colleagues had failed. And in the shadows of the castle's outer halls, whispers had already begun to stir among those who had orchestrated the king's poisoning in the first place, whispers that spoke not of celebration, but of a second plan already forming to correct what had gone wrong. 3 days passed before Draven had regained enough strength to hold court again, though even then, his advisors urged him to remain seated rather than stand for long periods. He accepted their caution reluctantly, more concerned with matters of the kingdom than his own lingering weakness. Yet before addressing any political matter, before hearing any report on the search for the delegates who had poisoned him, he insisted on one thing above all else. "Bring me the healer from Hollow Creek," he said to Kale, his voice still carrying traces of hoarseness from his ordeal. "I would speak with her properly, now that my mind is clear enough to do so." Alara had remained at the castle in the days following the king's recovery, partly at Kale's insistence and partly because she wished to monitor Draven's condition personally, unwilling to leave the final stages of his recovery to healers who had already proven unable to identify the poison correctly. She had spent those days largely in the kitchens and gardens, gathering additional herbs to strengthen his recovery, avoiding the political currents swirling through the rest of the castle. When she was finally brought before the king, she found him seated upright in a chair near the window of his chambers, rather than confined to his bed. Color fully returned to his face, his eyes sharp and alert in a way that confirmed just how completely her remedy had worked. "You saved my life," Draven said, before she had even finished her formal greeting. "I am told my own healers had exhausted every remedy they knew, and that you rode into a forest most people in this kingdom are too frightened to enter, twice, in order to find what I needed." "I did what needed doing," Alara said simply. "Nothing more." "You did what 3 trained healers, backed by every resource this castle could offer, failed to accomplish," Draven said. "That is not nothing, and I will not treat it as such." He rose from his chair then, slower than he might have liked given his lingering weakness, but with clear determination. Alara watched with growing confusion as he moved toward her, and then, to the shock of everyone present in the room, including Kale, Draven lowered himself to one knee before her. Gasps echoed through the chamber. No one present, not the guards, not the attending servants, not even Kale himself, had ever witnessed an Alpha King kneel before anyone within these walls, let alone a village herbalist with no title, no noble blood, and no claim to any station within the court. "Your Grace," Alara said quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the gesture. "Please, there is no need for this." "There is every need," Draven said, remaining exactly where he was. "You owed this kingdom nothing. You owed me nothing. And yet you risked your life, twice, for a king you had never met, asking for no reward before agreeing to help. That is a debt I intend to acknowledge properly, in front of witnesses, so that no one within these walls mistakes my gratitude for a passing courtesy." He rose slowly afterward, steadying himself briefly against the back of his chair, but his eyes remained fixed on Alara, with an intensity that seemed to carry far more than simple gratitude. "From this day, you will hold a permanent place within this court, should you choose to accept it. Not as a servant, and not as a temporary guest, but as this kingdom's royal herbalist, a title I am creating specifically, because none of our existing positions properly reflect what you have proven yourself capable of." Elara stood in stunned silence for a long moment, the weight of his words settling slowly over her. She had expected perhaps a reward of coin, enough to sustain her shop through a difficult season, or a formal thanks that would fade quickly from memory, once the excitement of the king's recovery settled. She had not expected this. "I have a life in Hollow Creek," she said finally, though her voice carried less certainty than it had just moments before. "A shop, villagers who depend on me. Then bring that knowledge here, and let it serve an entire kingdom rather than a single village," Draven said. "I am not asking you to abandon your people. I am asking you to expand your reach, with every resource this castle can offer standing behind you, rather than against you." Kale, who had remained quiet throughout this exchange, found himself watching Elara's expression closely, curious how she would respond to an offer that would fundamentally alter the life she had built for herself. He had spent enough time in her presence over these past days to understand that ambition was not what drove her, and he wondered if the king's offer might feel more like a burden to her than an honor. "I will consider it," Elara said finally, a diplomatic answer that satisfied neither her own uncertainty nor the king's evident hope for an immediate acceptance. "There is much to think through." "Take whatever time you require," Draven said, though something in his eyes suggested he hoped that time would be brief. The following weeks brought significant change to the castle, though not entirely the change anyone had anticipated. Bastian, Ophelia, and Godfrey found themselves increasingly overshadowed by the presence of the woman who had succeeded where they had failed, and while Ophelia and Godfrey seemed to accept this shift with something approaching grace, even seeking out Elara's guidance on several occasions, Bastian's resentment festered quietly beneath a carefully maintained facade of professional courtesy. It was during this period that Elara first crossed paths with Lord Edric Thorne, a nobleman whose family had long held influence within the court, though his ambitions had always seemed to outpace the modest territory his family actually controlled. Edric approached Elara during a quiet evening gathering, his manner smooth and practiced in the way of men accustomed to using charm as a tool rather than genuine warmth. "The kingdom owes you a great deal," Edric said, offering her a cup of wine she politely declined. "Though I confess some surprise that the king has chosen to elevate a village herbalist to such an unprecedented position. It is quite the departure from tradition. Perhaps tradition was due for a departure," Elara replied evenly, sensing something calculated beneath his pleasant words. "Perhaps," Edric agreed, though his tone carried a note of skepticism he did not bother to fully disguise. "Though I imagine such rapid elevation creates certain enemies among those who feel their own service has gone unrewarded by comparison." "I did not ask for elevation," Elara said. "I asked for nothing at all." "And yet you received it regardless," Edric said, offering a thin smile, before excusing himself to attend to other guests. Elara found herself troubled by the exchange, long after Edric had walked away, though she could not immediately identify what exactly unsettled her about his words. It was Kale, when she mentioned the conversation to him later that evening, who offered a clearer perspective. "Edric Thorne has spent years attempting to increase his family's influence within the court," Kale explained, his expression darkening slightly at the mention of the man's name. "His territory borders the eastern reaches of the kingdom, closer to several rival packs than most nobles would prefer. There have long been whispers that his loyalty extends further than his public allegiance suggests." "You believe he had something to do with the poisoning?" Elara asked. "I have no proof," Kale admitted, "but I have long suspected that whoever arranged for those delegates to poison the king required knowledge of the court's inner workings that outsiders alone could not have provided. Someone within these walls made that poisoning possible, whether directly or through carelessness." Elara considered this carefully, recalling the strange encounter in the forest, the two intruders who had followed them with clear purpose, wearing markings she had not recognized, but Kale had identified as belonging to the same delegates responsible for the king's poisoning. If Edric had indeed played some role in orchestrating the attack, it would explain both his suspicious familiarity with the political undercurrents surrounding her new position and his obvious discomfort with her continued presence at court. "We should watch him carefully," Elara said. We already are, Cale replied. Bastian's resentment found its outlet on a cold evening, nearly a month after the king's recovery, when Lord Edric Thorne sought him out privately in the healer's quarters, away from the ears of servants and guards alike. Bastian had spent weeks watching his own standing within the court diminish as Elara's reputation grew, and Edric recognized in that quiet bitterness an opportunity worth cultivating. It must be difficult, Edric said, settling into a chair across from where Bastian sat, sorting through old texts he no longer trusted to hold every answer. Decades of study, and a village girl arrives to claim the credit you rightfully deserved. I do not require your sympathy, Bastian said, though the sharpness in his voice betrayed how deeply the wound still stung. I am not offering sympathy, Edric replied smoothly. I am offering opportunity. The king has grown careless in his gratitude, elevating an outsider above men who have served this court faithfully for years. Such carelessness rarely goes unpunished by fate, wouldn't you agree? Bastian studied the nobleman carefully, sensing the calculated nature behind his words, even as curiosity got the better of his judgment. What exactly are you suggesting? Only that perhaps the girl's methods are not as trustworthy as the king believes, Edric said. A healer, who works with unwritten remedies, gathered from a forest most people consider dangerous and unpredictable. Who is to say her intentions remain as pure as they first appeared? Perhaps a small demonstration of doubt, planted at the right moment, might remind the king of the value men like you provide. Bastian remained silent for a long moment, weighing ambition against caution, resentment against the quiet voice of conscience that warned him against whatever scheme Edric was slowly unveiling. In the end, wounded pride proved stronger than caution. What do you propose? He asked. The plan that followed unfolded slowly over the following weeks, carefully disguised within the ordinary business of the court. Edric arranged for a minor noblewoman, a distant cousin loyal to his family's interests, to fall suddenly ill during a formal gathering, her symptoms carefully staged to mimic those of a mild poisoning. When Elara was summoned to treat her, as was now expected given her position, Bastian ensured that a vial of a genuinely dangerous substance was discovered hidden among her satchel shortly afterward, planted there during the chaos of the emergency. Word spread through the castle with alarming speed. Whispers turned to open accusation within hours, fueled by careful suggestions from both Edric and Bastian, who took great care to appear merely concerned rather than directly accusing. By the following morning, guards arrived at Elara's quarters, with orders to bring her before the king for formal questioning. This is absurd, Cale said, standing firmly beside Elara, as the guards explained their orders. She has done nothing but heal since the day she arrived within these walls. I only follow the king's command, the lead guard replied apologetically, clearly uncomfortable with his own task. The vial was found among her belongings. Questions must be asked. Elara remained calm despite the accusation, though Cale could see the tension building beneath her composed exterior. I have never carried that substance, she said firmly. I would never carry something capable of causing genuine harm, not after everything I have done to prevent it. Then we will prove that in front of the king, Cale said, his tone leaving no room for argument, but we will do so together. The court that gathered to hear the accusations against Elara carried a very different atmosphere than the celebration that had followed the king's recovery just weeks earlier. Whispers filled the hall as she was brought before Draven, who sat upon his throne with an expression that revealed little of his true feelings on the matter, though Cale, standing close enough to read the subtle tension in his jaw, understood that the king was far from convinced of her guilt. The vial discovered among your belongings contained a substance capable of causing serious harm, Draven said, his voice measured and formal despite the private conversations they had shared in recent weeks. I must ask you directly. Did you place that noblewoman in danger? No, your grace, Elara said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I have never carried that substance, nor would I ever use it against anyone within this court or beyond it. Bastian, standing among the gathered healers, spoke up before the king could respond further. With respect, your grace, we cannot simply take her word against physical evidence discovered in her own possession. And how exactly was this evidence discovered? Cale asked sharply, turning to face Bastian directly. Who searched her belongings, and under what authority? The question hung in the air, and Bastian's composure faltered slightly before he recovered enough to answer. A servant discovered it, while retrieving supplies during the emergency. Which servant? Cale pressed. Bastian hesitated, clearly uncertain how to answer without revealing more than he intended. The silence stretched long enough that murmurs began rippling through the gathered court, suspicion shifting slowly away from Alara and toward the healer struggling to justify his claim. It was at this moment that Alara remembered something from the journals her grandmother had left behind. Pages filled not just with remedies, but with careful observations about the political dangers healers sometimes faced within noble courts. Warnings passed down from a time when her grandmother herself had briefly served among nobility, before choosing the quieter life of a village healer instead. "Your Grace," Alara said, turning back toward the throne, "I would ask that my satchel be examined properly, by someone with true knowledge of herbs and their sources, rather than assumed guilty based on a vial's mere presence. My grandmother taught me always to mark my own preparations with a specific symbol, pressed into the wax, sealing each container. If this vial lacks that mark, it did not come from my hands." Draven considered this request for a moment, before nodding toward Godfrey, whose earlier curiosity about Alara's methods had grown into genuine respect over the preceding weeks. "Examine it," the king commanded. Godfrey retrieved the vial in question and studied its wax seal carefully under the light of the hall's torches, turning it slowly in his hands while the court waited in tense silence. After a long moment, he looked up, his expression carrying clear surprise. "There is no mark, Your Grace," he confirmed. "This seal bears no symbol at all, unlike every other preparation I have observed from the royal herbalist's own supplies over these past weeks." Murmurs rippled through the court once more, this time carrying a different tone entirely. Draven's gaze sharpened, turning slowly toward Bastian, whose composure had begun visibly crumbling under the weight of mounting scrutiny. "If this vial did not come from her supplies," Draven said slowly, "then someone placed it there deliberately, intending to frame her for a crime she did not commit. I would very much like to know who." Cale stepped forward then, having spent the preceding minutes watching the crowd carefully for any sign of the true architect behind this scheme. His eyes settled on Lord Edric Thorne, standing near the back of the hall with an expression that, to anyone paying close attention, carried far too much satisfaction for someone merely observing a troubling accusation. "Your Grace," Cale said, "I would ask that Lord Edric Thorne account for his whereabouts during the noblewoman's sudden illness, and his relationship to the cousin who fell ill so conveniently at this particular gathering." The hall fell into stunned silence at the direct accusation. Edric's expression shifted rapidly from calm confidence to poorly concealed alarm, though he attempted to maintain his composure, even as every eye in the room turned toward him. "This is an outrageous suggestion," Edric said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words intended to convey. "I have no connection to whatever scheme you are describing." "Your cousin fell ill at a gathering you personally arranged," Cale said, pressing forward without hesitation. "And the healer who first raised suspicion against the royal herbalist has been seen in private conversation with you on more than one occasion these past weeks, according to several members of the household staff." Bastian's face had gone pale by this point, the weight of the unfolding accusation clearly too much for his composure to withstand. "I acted only out of concern for this court's proper order," he said weakly, his earlier conviction crumbling rapidly. Lord Thorne suggested that perhaps the girl's rapid rise deserved closer scrutiny. "Suggested or instructed?" Draven asked, his voice carrying a cold authority that silenced the remaining murmurs throughout the hall. Bastian's silence answered the question more clearly than any words could have. The king rose slowly from his throne, his gaze moving between Bastian's crumbling composure and Edric's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his innocence. The hall remained utterly silent, every courtier and guard watching the unfolding scene with rapt attention, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple accusation against a herbalist. "Guards," Draven said finally, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Detain Lord Thorne, and hold him for formal questioning regarding both this scheme and the poisoning that nearly cost me my life weeks ago." Edric's calm finally shattered entirely as guards moved toward him, his voice rising in protest, even as their hands closed firmly around his arms. "You have no proof of any connection between myself and the delegates who poisoned you," he said, though the desperation in his tone suggested otherwise. "Then questioning will either confirm your innocence or reveal your guilt," Draven replied evenly. Either way, the truth will emerge, and you will answer for whatever role you played. As the guards escorted Edric from the hall, his protests fading into the corridors beyond, Draven turned his attention to Bastian, who remained standing where he had been, shoulders slumped beneath the weight of his own poor choices. "You served this court faithfully for many years before this moment," Draven said, his tone carrying more disappointment than anger. "I would know why you chose to abandon that service for the sake of wounded pride." "I believed my years of study deserved more recognition than they received," Bastian admitted quietly, his earlier arrogance entirely dissolved. "When the royal herbalist succeeded where I failed, I allowed resentment to cloud my judgment. Lord Thorn offered an outlet for that resentment, and I foolishly accepted it." Draven studied him for a long moment before responding. "Your service these past years has not gone unnoticed, Bastian, whatever your recent failures. But conspiring to frame an innocent healer, one who saved my life at great personal risk, cannot go unpunished. You will be removed from your position within this court, effective immediately, though I will not pursue further punishment beyond that removal, given your years of prior service." Bastian nodded slowly, accepting the judgment without further protest, his earlier fire entirely extinguished by the reality of what his choices had cost him. He was escorted from the hall soon after, leaving behind a court still processing the rapid unraveling of a scheme that had nearly destroyed an innocent woman's reputation and safety. Elara remained standing before the throne throughout this entire exchange, relief slowly settling over her features as the accusations against her crumbled entirely away. Kale moved to stand beside her once more, his expression carrying quiet pride at how swiftly the truth had emerged, though his eyes lingered on her with something warmer than simple professional respect. "Are you well?" he asked quietly, once the hall had begun to empty, and the immediate danger had fully passed. "I am now," Elara said, though her voice still carried traces of the tension she had held throughout the ordeal. "Thank you, for believing me, when others were quick to doubt." "I never doubted you," Kale said simply, "not for a moment." Draven approached them both once the hall had cleared sufficiently, his expression carrying genuine remorse, despite the swift resolution of the false accusation. "I owe you an apology," he said to Elara. "I should never have allowed doubt to take root so easily, not after everything you have already proven about your character and your loyalty to this kingdom." "You were presented with evidence that appeared convincing," Elara said, understanding his position, even if the experience had shaken her deeply. "I do not fault you for demanding answers when a noble woman's safety appeared threatened." "Regardless," Draven said, "I intend to ensure nothing like this happens again. Guards will be assigned to protect your quarters and your work from this point forward, and any accusation against you will require far more substantial proof before it reaches my ears as anything beyond rumor." Over the following days, the full extent of Edric Thorn's involvement in the king's original poisoning came to light through careful questioning conducted by Kale and several trusted guards. Letters discovered within Edric's private chambers revealed correspondence with representatives from a rival pack territory. Correspondence that outlined plans to weaken Veyrath's leadership through poison rather than open conflict, believing a kingdom thrown into chaos by a sudden succession crisis would prove far easier to exploit than one prepared for war. Edric's ambition, it emerged, extended beyond mere resentment toward Elara's rising status. He had hoped that with the king dead and no clear heir named, the resulting instability would create opportunity for his own family to expand its influence, potentially even claim a position of power within whatever new arrangement emerged from the chaos. When his initial plan failed thanks to Elara's intervention, he had turned his attention toward eliminating the woman who had thwarted his ambitions, hoping to remove the one variable that had unexpectedly interfered with his careful scheme. The full truth, once revealed to the court, secured Edric's fate entirely. Stripped of his title and lands, he was exiled from the kingdom's borders, his family's territory placed under direct oversight from the crown, to prevent any future scheming from taking root within that region again. It was a resolution that satisfied the court's demand for justice, while avoiding the kind of harsh punishment that might have created further instability among the nobility. With the conspiracy fully unraveled and her name cleared of any wrongdoing, Elara found herself once again standing before Draven in his private chambers, the same offer he had extended weeks earlier still hanging unresolved between them. You still have not given me your answer, Draven said, watching her carefully. Regarding the position of royal herbalist. Alara considered the question for a long moment, thinking of her grandmother's shop in Hollow Creek, the villagers who had come to depend on her care, and the strange, unexpected path that had led her from that quiet life into the heart of a kingdom's politics and danger. I would ask for one condition, she said finally. Name it, Draven replied without hesitation. I wish to divide my time, Alara said, between this court and my village. The people of Hollow Creek deserve care as much as anyone within these walls, and I will not abandon them, simply because a title has been offered to me here. Draven considered this request briefly before nodding. Then it shall be arranged. You will serve as royal herbalist, with the freedom to return to your village as often as your duties allow. I will ensure proper support reaches Hollow Creek in your absence, so that your people never feel forgotten by this court. Then I accept, Alara said, a small smile finally breaking through the tension that had defined the past several weeks. Kale, who had remained present throughout this conversation, found himself feeling a quiet relief at her decision, one that went beyond simple professional satisfaction at securing such valuable expertise for the kingdom. In the weeks that had passed since their journey through the Whisperwood together, something had shifted between them, a bond forged through shared danger and mutual respect that neither had fully acknowledged aloud. I am glad you are staying, he said, once Draven had excused himself to attend to other pressing matters of state. Are you? Alara asked, studying his expression with the same careful attention she gave to identifying rare herbs. More than I expected to be, Kale admitted, a rare vulnerability entering his usually composed demeanor. You have changed how I see many things these past weeks, not just about healers or village life, but about what genuine courage looks like when it is not wrapped in a soldier's armor. Alara felt warmth rise in her cheeks at his words, an unexpected reaction given how composed she had remained through every danger of the preceding weeks. I have changed as well, she said quietly. I did not expect to find such steady company within these castle walls. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a servant, bearing news that would soon reshape the kingdom's understanding of what true leadership required, though neither Alara nor Kale could have anticipated just how significant the following months would prove for both of them, and for the entire realm of Veyrath. Months passed, and the kingdom of Veyrath settled into a new rhythm, shaped by the events that had nearly claimed its king's life. Alara divided her time exactly as she had requested, spending several weeks at the castle, before returning to Hollow Creek to tend her shop and check on the villagers, who had depended on her care long before any king had ever known her name. The arrangement suited her well, allowing her to carry knowledge between both worlds, teaching the royal healers what she knew of the Whisperwood's rare properties, while never abandoning the quieter duties that had first shaped her into the healer she had become. Godfrey, in particular, proved an eager student, spending long hours alongside her whenever she remained at the castle, determined to learn methods that might one day save another life, the way Moonbloom had saved the king's. Ophelia, too, found herself increasingly drawn to Alara's unconventional wisdom, eventually requesting permission to accompany her on a supervised visit to the edges of the Whisperwood, curious to witness firsthand the source of knowledge that had so thoroughly reshaped her understanding of proper healing. Draven, for his part, found his own relationship with Alara evolving steadily over these passing months, shaped by countless conversations that extended well beyond matters of medicine or court politics. He sought her counsel not only on questions of health, but increasingly on matters of judgment and fairness, valuing her perspective as someone who had spent her life among common villagers rather than nobility, someone whose instincts had not been shaped by the same rigid traditions that governed most of his advisors. You see things differently than anyone else within these walls, he admitted to her, one evening, as they walked together through the castle gardens, the autumn air carrying the first hints of the coming winter chill. I find myself grateful for that difference more often than I expected. Perhaps that difference is exactly what a kingdom needs sometimes, Alara replied. Too many voices agreeing with each other rarely produces good judgment. Draven smiled at that, a genuine warmth in his expression that had grown increasingly common during their conversations over recent weeks. You have taught me a great deal since that first day you knelt beside my bed, examining a poison none of my trained healers could properly identify. And you taught me that even the most powerful among us can recognize when we need help, Alara said. That is no small lesson either, for a king who had never before had reason to doubt his own healers. Their walks through the garden became a regular occurrence over the following months, quiet moments away from the demands of the court, where honest conversation could flow freely between two people who had each, in their own way, been transformed by the events surrounding the poisoning and its aftermath. Cale observed this growing closeness with quiet understanding, recognizing that whatever warmth had briefly stirred between himself and Alara during their journey through the Whisperwood had settled instead into a steady, valued friendship, one built on mutual respect rather than romantic pursuit. He found himself content with this outcome, understanding perhaps before either Alara or Draven fully acknowledged it themselves, that something deeper was forming between the king and his royal herbalist. The formal recognition of that bond came nearly a year after the poisoning that had nearly ended Draven's life, during a celebration marking the anniversary of his recovery. The Great Hall, once filled with panic and fear on that terrible night, now overflowed with music and laughter. The entire court gathered to honor both the king's continued health and the woman whose knowledge had preserved it. Draven rose during the celebration, calling for silence throughout the hall, and once again, as he had done that first day when her gratitude had shocked the entire court, he moved toward Alara with clear purpose in his stride. "A year ago," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "I lay dying in this very castle, poisoned by enemies who believed a kingdom without its king would prove easy prey for their ambitions. Every healer, trained within these walls, every resource this court could offer, failed to save me. It was a village herbalist, a woman who owed this kingdom nothing, who walked into a forest most of my own soldiers feared to enter, not once but twice, and found what none of us could provide ourselves." He paused, his gaze finding Alara's across the crowded hall, warmth evident in his expression, despite the formal weight of the occasion. "I knelt before her that day, and I meant every part of that gesture, not merely gratitude for a life saved, though that gratitude remains as strong today as it was then, but recognition that true worth, within this kingdom, is not measured by noble blood or inherited title, but by character, by courage, and by a willingness to help others, even when no reward is promised in return." The hall remained silent, every courtier and guest understanding that something significant was unfolding before them, something beyond the simple anniversary celebration they had gathered to attend. Alara of Hollow Creek has served this kingdom faithfully these past months, dividing her time between her village and this court with a generosity few among us could match, Draven continued. "I would ask her now, before this entire gathering, whether she might consider extending that partnership even further, joining not merely as this court's royal herbalist, but as my equal, standing beside me in every matter that shapes this kingdom's future." Alara stood in stunned silence for a long moment, the weight of his words and the meaning behind them settling slowly across the crowded hall. She had grown close to this man over the preceding months, had come to value his counsel as much as he valued hers, had found in him a partner whose respect for her knowledge never wavered, even when others had doubted her. Yet she had never quite allowed herself to imagine this particular outcome, this formal acknowledgement of a bond that had grown quietly and steadily since that first desperate night, when Cale had ridden into her village, seeking help for a dying king. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "A year ago, I walked into this castle, expecting nothing beyond the chance to help someone in genuine need. I never imagined that choice would lead me here, standing before an entire court, being asked such a question." "And your answer?" Draven asked, though the hopeful warmth in his expression suggested he already anticipated her response. "My answer," Alara said, a smile finally breaking through her composed expression, "is that I would be honored to stand beside you, in whatever capacity that partnership requires, for as long as this kingdom and its people need us both." The hall erupted into celebration at her words, the tension of the moment breaking into genuine joy shared throughout the gathered court. Cale, standing near the edge of the crowd, allowed himself a rare, unguarded smile at witnessing the culmination of a bond he had watched grow steadily since that first ride toward Hollow Creek so many months earlier. In the months that followed, Alara continued her work exactly as she always had, tending to both the castle's needs and her village's ongoing care, never abandoning the roots that had shaped her into the healer capable of saving a kingdom's future. The Whisperwood remained as mysterious and dangerous as it had always been, its creatures still watching over their ancient domain with silent patience, indifferent to the changes unfolding within the human kingdom that bordered their territory. But within the castle walls, something fundamental had shifted, a recognition that true strength sometimes arrived in unexpected forms, that wisdom did not require noble blood to prove its worth, and that even the most powerful among alphas could find themselves humbled before someone whose only claim to greatness lay in a willingness to help, without hesitation, when the world around her needed saving most. And so it was that the herbalist from Hollow Creek, who had once brewed what 3 royal healers together could not achieve, found her place not merely as a healer within a distant kingdom's court, but as a partner to the very king who had once knelt before her in gratitude. A debt repaid not through obligation, but through a bond that would guide Veyrath toward a future neither of them could have imagined on that terrible night when everything had first begun to change.